It was Christmas Eve, but for James, that wasn't the holiday spirit. He watched the fire crackling in the corner of the room, and through the window, he could see the snow falling gently on the well-kept lawn of his home in Greenwich, Connecticut. The mansion looked cozy, illuminated by the Christmas lights, with his daughters laughing inside, playing with the toys that he and Ava had so carefully chosen. But James wasn't there because of the kids or the decorations. He was there for a much darker reason. In his hand, the wine glass trembled slightly. The reflection of the red liquid mingled with the soft light of the candles on the table. But his mind was elsewhere. It was on Savannah, the mistress he had spent the last few months secretly meeting in luxurious hotel rooms and apartments in downtown Manhattan. She was waiting for something he didn't want to give, but already knew was about to be handed to him. The doorbell rang. James held his breath before setting the glass down and walking toward the door. When he opened it, it wasn't Ava, his wife, but Savannah, with an expression filled with something he couldn't quite identify. She stood there in the hallway, wearing an expensive fur coat, a forced smile, but a look of desperation in her eyes. She entered without a word, walking with determined steps to the center of the room where the children were. "We need to talk," she said, getting straight to the point. James furrowed his brow, anxiety mixing with a sense of guilt he tried to ignore. He already knew what she was about to say. He knew that, at that moment, everything was about to come crashing down. "Not here, Savannah. Not now," he whispered, nervous. But she wasn't willing to wait. She looked directly into his eyes without hesitation. "James, I'm pregnant." Those words cut through the air between them like a sharp blade. The silence that followed was deafening. James, in shock, felt the blood rush to his head. He thought quickly, trying to organize his words, but nothing made sense. How was he supposed to react? What did she want from him? Ava, his beloved wife, was inside with their daughters, and here he was with his mistress in the living room, receiving such a revelation. Fear took over him, the need to protect his perfect life. He couldn't let this spiral out of control. He couldn't risk losing everything. You can't be serious," James stammered, trying to keep calm. Savannah nodded, a sad and almost desperate smile on her face. "I'm serious, James, and I need an answer. Because I'm keeping this baby." The silence was absolute. James took a deep breath, trying to process what he had just heard. His eyes were fixed on her, but his mind was racing, thinking of possible exits, of the consequences. Anguish mixed with fear, he looked around the room, at his daughters and Ava, who were inside, innocent. This was a nightmare. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice now lacking the confidence it once had. Savannah looked at him coldly, as though she had expected this reaction. She took a deep breath before speaking. "I want you to do what's right, James. I want you to help me, to take care of me and our child. But if you can't, leave me alone. I don't want anything else from you." But that wasn't what James wanted to hear. He already knew what he had to do. His reaction was instinctive, and instead of offering help or a solution that she had hoped for, he did something she never imagined. "I can help you financially, Savannah," he said, looking straight at her. "I'll give you whatever you want, a large sum of money, but you need to disappear. Go away and never come back. I can't let this destroy my life." Her reaction was instant. Her face twisted in pain, anger, and indignation. But as much as she wanted to, she knew she couldn't do anything in that moment. The man she loved, the one she dreamed of building something with, was offering her money to disappear with the child. He was more concerned with his perfect life than with anything concerning their future. Savannah looked at him one last time, and in her eyes, there was no more love, only loneliness. She turned away without saying another word and left through the door, leaving James alone with his dark thoughts. But the story didn't end there. What James didn't know was that this Christmas, which had started like any other, was about to turn into the greatest nightmare of his life. When Ava found out what was happening, the game of lies would begin, and no one would walk away unscathed. James sat in the armchair, still staring at the door Savannah had walked through. The silence in the room seemed heavy, suffocating, as though even the fireplace had lost its warmth. He couldn't stop thinking about her words, that expression of pain and desperation he never imagined he'd see in her eyes. She had expected a different reaction, something nobler perhaps. But what he offered her was only money. Money for her to leave and let his life go on without being altered. The truth was, James knew he had made a mistake, but the weight of responsibility frightened him. The fear of losing Ava, of destroying the family he held so dear, prevented him from seeing the bigger picture. He didn't know what was worse, the thought that Ava would find out what he had done, or the idea of being dragged into a dead-end situation, with Savannah and her pregnancy becoming a shadow over everything he had built. Ava entered the room without making a sound. He heard her approach but was so absorbed in his thoughts that he didn't react immediately. She stopped at the door, watching him with an expression he couldn't understand. Something in her gaze had changed since the moment she walked in, just before he went to meet Savannah. "James, are you okay?" Ava's voice pulled him out of his stupor. He looked at her, trying to smile, but it was a forced one. The doubt was clear on her face, and he knew something was wrong. She had never been a woman who showed insecurity, but in that moment, something was deeply troubling her. "Of course, Ava. I was just thinking about a few things." "Nothing important," he replied, his voice calmer than he actually felt. Ava walked over to him, placing a hand on his shoulder, but there was a tension in the gesture, something that hadn't been there before. She had always known when he was lying, or at least when he was omitting something important. And no matter how hard he tried to cover it up, James knew she was beginning to sense that something was off. "You don't seem all right, James. Is there something you need to tell me?" she insisted, her gaze fixed on his, like a sharp arrow. He swallowed hard. What did she know? Was it the scent of Savannah still on him, the fact that she had been there, or perhaps it was the pressure in his face, the look of someone who knew but had no proof? He opened his mouth, but the words wouldn't come out. He wanted to tell the truth, but what would that truth be? The truth would destroy him, and he didn't know if he had the courage to face it. Ava stepped back, sitting on the couch, still watching him. He tried to look away, but it was impossible to escape the intensity of her gaze. She knew him better than he knew himself. "James, have you been lying to me?" The question came directly and sharply. He didn't know how to answer. The words felt bitter in his mouth. Instead, he just stared at her, trying to appear calm, but he knew time was running out. At some point, the truth would come to light. Meanwhile, Savannah was in her apartment in downtown Manhattan, lost in her own thoughts. She knew that revealing her pregnancy wouldn't bring anything good, but with every passing second, the weight of her decision to stay seemed stronger. She couldn't just disappear and let the child grow up without a father. Something inside her pushed her to fight, and though she didn't know if she was acting the right way, she wouldn't regret it. She picked up her phone and called a trusted friend, a woman with whom she shared secrets, someone who knew about James' affair and now knew about the pregnancy. "He's going to try to push me away, you know that, right?" she asked, her tone one of someone who had been expecting the answer. "He will. And he will do anything to keep up appearances. I don't believe James has the guts to acknowledge paternity. But you have something he doesn't expect, Savannah, and he'll feel it." Savannah lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling, imagining the future. She didn't know what it would be like, but she knew she wouldn't back down. If James didn't have the courage to act responsibly, she would take control of the situation. And no matter how hard it was, she wouldn't allow his fear to dictate the fate of the baby. That same night, something in the air changed. Ava began to notice the signs. That discomfort, that strange feeling she had when James pulled away. She knew her husband better than anyone, but she couldn't understand what was happening. She felt betrayed, but she still didn't know how. What she didn't know was that the key to the revelation was closer than she imagined. James, for his part, found himself playing a game of manipulation with himself. He was torn between the need to protect his family and the desire to continue with what he considered to be his secret life. But there would be no more hiding the lies. The truth was coming, and with every passing minute, it became more inevitable. The following morning was silent. The Christmas tree was still there, but now it felt like a grim reminder. Ava got up early, preparing breakfast for the girls. James, on the other hand, seemed more distant, lost in his own thoughts. But the tension in the air was palpable. Savannah, sooner than she had expected, would receive a phone call that would change the course of things. The game was about to intensify, and no one would leave unscathed. The night of December 26th was marked by the biting cold that filled James' house. The lights on the Christmas tree were still on, but the warmth of the holiday season seemed to be fading, giving way to a heavy atmosphere of tension that filled every corner of the mansion. Ava had noticed something was wrong. James' words, his actions, everything that had once seemed normal now felt false. She no longer saw him the same way, as if a veil had been lifted from her eyes. The pressure in her mind was growing, and she knew she was about to discover the truth, no matter how much it would hurt. She spent the night thinking about James' words, about that empty expression he had when he spoke about money. She knew he hadn't acted ethically, but what else was he hiding? It couldn't just be a mistake, a slip-up. Something bigger was going on. Meanwhile, Savannah was in her apartment, holding the phone, trying not to panic. What she was about to do could change everything, but the situation she was in didn't offer many options. She had decided to call her lawyer, the same one who had helped friends in similar situations. The conversation would be difficult but necessary. She didn't want to, but she knew she had to make it clear that she wouldn't give in to James' pressure. "I know he's going to try to bribe me," Dr. Savannah said, trying to control her trembling voice. "He offered me a large sum of money to disappear, but that's not going to happen. I won't vanish, not with the child." The lawyer on the other end of the line sighed, his voice deep and cautious. "Savannah, do you know what you're doing? The situation with James is delicate. If you pursue legal action, things could get out of control. He's powerful, he has resources, and he can make your life very difficult. But if you're willing to go all the way, we'll need evidence." She didn't hesitate. "I know, but I can't let him keep doing this. I can't allow him to live this lie." The call ended with a promise of future actions, and Savannah hung up. Feeling the weight of the decision, she was sure she couldn't go back now. The baby deserved the truth, and she wouldn't allow anyone to take that away from her. Meanwhile, James' house was still immersed in a suffocating silence. He could no longer look at Ava the same way. His wife, who once seemed strong and decisive, was now different. He could feel the distance between them growing with each passing day. The lie was about to become unbearable. On the morning of the 27th, when James entered the kitchen for breakfast, Ava was already there, with a distant look, as if she had been waiting for him. She didn't say anything immediately, but the tension was palpable. The smell of fresh coffee didn't seem to calm him. He knew she was waiting for something, and with every passing second, the sense that the truth would come to light grew stronger. Ava got up from the table, and before he could say a word, she spoke directly, without hesitation. "James, I'm waiting for an explanation, and I won't stop until you tell me the truth. What's going on between you and Savannah?" He swallowed hard, unsure of how to react. The lie he had been feeding was about to explode, and he no longer had control of the situation. Words piled up in his head, but he knew that no matter how hard he tried, he could no longer deceive her. Ava already knew. She had suspected it before, and now she was sure. James' behavior in the last few days, the way he avoided conversations, the moments when he seemed distant, all of it led her to one conclusion. She knew about the affair, and now she was ready to confront him. "I know you're hiding something from me, James, and I know Savannah is involved. Do you think I'm blind?" Her voice was calm, but the anger was evident between the lines. He looked at her, trying to control his nervousness, but he knew the moment to act had arrived. "Ava, I was trying to protect you. What else are you hiding from me?" He sat down at the table, the weight of guilt pressing on his chest. There was no turning back. He knew he couldn't escape it. "She's pregnant. I didn't want you to know, Ava. I just wanted To avoid all this, Ava's reaction was a shock, but not as he had imagined. She didn't burst into tears, she didn't yell, she simply remained silent for a few seconds, processing the information. Then, with a tone James had never heard from her before, she spoke. "So, you think you can destroy our family, our life, and I'll just sit here waiting like a fool?" "No, James, I won't stay silent anymore. I won't let you continue with this lie." James knew that the only chance to save something was to take full responsibility, but he also knew this was only the beginning. The truth was exposed, and nothing could undo the damage he had caused. At that moment, James' phone vibrated. It was a message from Savannah. "Ava knows," the message read. James' world came crashing down. He could no longer control anything. The pieces were on the board, and the game, now, had no turning back. The following day was a whirlwind of emotions for everyone involved. James' house felt colder than ever, even with the warmth of the fireplace. The tension was palpable, and Ava knew that from that moment on, nothing would ever be the same. She had always prided herself on being a strong woman, a devoted wife, but right then, she felt lost. James' words still echoed in her mind. "She's pregnant." It felt like a punch to the stomach. Ava got up early, preparing breakfast for the girls, but her mind was far away. The girls had no idea what was happening, and she wanted to keep them out of it for now. But she knew the truth was something they would need to know sooner or later. She sighed deeply, thinking about how she would tell them if the moment came. She didn't want any of this pain to affect them, but she knew she couldn't keep living this lie. James sat in silence at the table, his shoulders slumped. He knew what he had done couldn't be undone, but the thought of losing Ava, of losing everything, was eating him alive. He tried to talk to her several times, but she was in a state of coldness he had never imagined. She seemed to be waiting for him to explain himself, but he didn't know how to explain the inexplicable. When James' phone vibrated again, he knew he couldn't escape anymore. It was a message from Savannah. She wanted to meet him. He knew the moment of facing the consequences was near, but he still tried to convince himself that he could get out of this. Maybe he could fix things. Maybe he could convince Ava that it was all just a mistake. But deep down, he knew that would never be possible again. "James," Ava's voice cut through the silence, making him turn quickly toward her. She was standing, looking at him with a gaze he had never imagined seeing in her. It wasn't anger or disgust. It was deeper, as if she was trying to understand how everything had come to this. How, in one moment, she had become a woman she no longer recognized. "You're going to meet her, aren't you?" Ava asked with a chilling calmness. James choked. She knew. I can't escape this, Ava. I can't escape reality," he said, feeling the weight of the confession. Ava shook her head, as if that moment marked the end of a cycle. She no longer cared about what he would do. She already knew what he had done, and now it was time to decide what she would do. The silence between them became unbearable. She took a step toward the door. "Ava, please," James pleaded, but his voice was weak. She turned around, her gaze firm. "I don't want to hear any more apologies. I want to know what you're going to do now, because I'm not waiting for you. Not while you still hold the same values you did before." James didn't know how to respond. His words seemed weightless. She had already made up her mind, and he knew it. When Ava left, he was left alone. For the first time in years, he found himself facing the consequences of his choices, not knowing what to do. Meanwhile, Savannah waited, a mix of anxiety and anger filling her as she sat in the restaurant where she had arranged the meeting. She knew that once she saw James, nothing would ever be the same again. There was a tension in the air, something that made her feel like everything could collapse at any moment. When he arrived, they stared at each other for a long moment, without saying a word. The environment around them seemed irrelevant, as if time had suspended. Savannah wanted to scream, to ask what he thought he was doing, but instead, she spoke with a calmness that surprised even herself. "You're not going to get away with this, James. I'm not hiding anymore. I won't let you keep up this farce." James tried to find words, but nothing made sense. How could he justify the unjustifiable? He knew he was lost, and when he looked at Savannah, he realized she no longer feared him. "I'll take responsibility, Savannah," he said, with a sincerity he never imagined he had in him. She laughed, but it wasn't a laugh of relief. It was bitter, full of disillusionment. "No, James. You're going to try to do what you always do, control everything. But you can't control this. Not anymore. Not after everything you've done." He fell silent. What she said made sense. He knew he was facing a reality he could no longer shape to his liking. Savannah stood up, ready to leave. She had a decision to make, but she knew the battle had just begun. Whatever happened, she wouldn't be intimidated. The future of her child wasn't at stake, but neither would her own be sacrificed. Meanwhile, at James' house, Ava was determined to take the next step. She didn't know exactly what it would be, but she knew the time for waiting had passed. She would take control of the situation, and James would have no choice. He would learn the hard way that his lies and manipulations no longer held power over her. Ava no longer thought about how to save the marriage. She was thinking about how to save herself. The following days were torture for James. He knew he could no longer go back. The ground he had tried to control, manipulate, and shape with money, power, and lies was now being swallowed by the truth, which seemed to take on an unbeatable form. His perfect world crumbled before his eyes, and he found himself powerless in the face of the wave of consequences he had created. Savannah and Ava, though so different, were now united by the pain of their choices. The bond between them, though for different reasons, grew quietly. While James desperately tried to repair the damage he had caused, the two women were already beginning to rewrite their own stories. It was a cold January morning, and James' house, which used to be a symbol of power and wealth, now seemed empty, not just of people, but of life. Ava was there, but she was no longer the woman he knew. Her eyes were resolute, firm, without traces of the submissive, idealistic woman he had once known. She was distant, but not because he had pushed her away. She had already distanced herself on her own. James knew she looked at him now with eyes that no longer expected anything from him, but sought to reclaim her own life. They met that morning in the kitchen. The smell of coffee lingered in the air, but the feeling that everything had changed hung like a fog over the table. "I've thought a lot about all of this, James," Ava began, her voice calm but heavy with meaning. "And I think I finally understand what needs to be done. We're no longer on the same page, not even in the same story. We're no longer the same." He looked at her with regret, as if somehow still hoping she would change her mind. But something in her gaze stopped her from yielding. She was no longer there to make concessions. "Ava, please, don't," he started, but she interrupted him with a simple gesture of her hand. "There's no room for apologies anymore, James," she said firmly. "I can't live in a lie any longer, and you can't keep using our life as if it's a game to satisfy your own desires." She wasn't shouting. She wasn't crying. She was completely in control of herself, and that made him realize something he had ignored all along. Ava wasn't the fragile woman he thought he knew. She was strong, and now he was seeing that clearly. James knew that if there was any chance of saving the marriage, it had already dissipated. He had lost his wife, lost her respect, and in the blink of an eye, he had also lost her trust. But what hurt him the most was knowing he hadn't just failed Ava. He had failed himself. "What are you going to do, Ava?" James asked, desperately trying to hold onto a thread of hope. She looked at him, her eyes filled with a silent pain, but also with a determination he never imagined he'd see. "I will move on. I will rebuild my life. And you should do the same. I can no longer live with the consequences of your mistakes. It's time for us to separate." At that moment, something inside James finally broke. He had always lived believing he could control everything, that he could manipulate situations, use his money and power to turn things in his favor. But now, he was facing a reality he couldn't control, and it left him powerless. The woman he had loved so much was leaving, and he didn't know how to stop it. Meanwhile, Savannah had reached a point in her life where she could no longer afford to wait. The future of her child was in her hands, and she was willing to face anything to protect him. When she finally met with James, it wasn't in a restaurant or a meeting room. It was in a neutral place, a simple cafe, where the masks could fall for a moment. "I've already made my decision, James," Savannah began bluntly. She no longer needed empty words or broken promises. She knew what she wanted, and that was all that mattered. "I don't want your money. I don't want anything from you, except respect. For me and for my child." James, sitting across from her, felt that humiliation was the price he would have to pay for his actions. He wanted to apologize, but the words felt useless. Savannah looked at him with a firmness that he no longer saw in herself, but which he now respected. "I will keep the child, and I will take care of him the best way I can." "I don't need you for that," she said, her voice cold and emotionless. James looked at her, not as a lover, but as the woman who had finally taken control of her life. And in some way, he felt a respect he had never felt before. The selfishness he had carried for so long was fading, like a cloud dispersing. In that moment, James realized his life had changed. He no longer had control. He could no longer manipulate the people around him. He could no longer make everything bend to his will. The pain of losing Ava was immense, but what haunted him more was the pain of losing himself. The story of James, Ava, and Savannah was coming to an end, but contrary to what he had imagined, it wasn't the end of a cycle of victories. It was the end of his illusion of power and control. They were heading in different directions now, and there was nothing he could do to change that. Ava moved on, not with revenge, but with the certainty that she deserved more than the lies she had accepted for years. Savannah, in turn, moved forward with the promise to give her child the best future possible. And James remained there alone, facing the consequence of his life filled with selfish choices and betrayals. The lesson he had learned was simple, but devastating. The truth always finds its way, and no matter how much you try to avoid it, the price of lies will always be paid.